I'm using this gadget instead of printed speaking notes, so I'm not quite sure how it's going to function. Distinguished guests, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, it is with a great sense of personal satisfaction and pride that I address the inaugural Australia-China Youth Dialogue. It was 4 years ago, almost to the day, that I first met Henry Macon here in Beijing as a member of the inaugural Wenjiabao invited Australian youth delegation to visit China. Even then, Henry dreamed of establishing an organisation that would, in many respects, fulfil Premier Wen's mandate given to our delegation, one that increased dialogue and exchange between the youth of Australia and China. It is to the great credit of Henry and his fine group of colleagues that this initiative, one that I hope will emerge as a signature event in our bilateral relationship, has come to fruition. It is with great pride that as a young Australian with an immense personal and professional interest in China, and as the National Executive Director of the Australia-China Business Council, that I join you here today. It is also with great trepidation that I appear after the likes of Dr. Richard Rigby and alongside my mentor and friend, the great Professor Jeremy Barmay. Now let's get down to business. The geostrategic rebalancing of the Asia-Pacific and world order is fundamentally changing our lives. Professor Hugh White's recent assessment of the implications of China's restoration to its rightful place in global power was that it does not threaten Australia, but it does change our world. As a young Asia-literate Australian, there are two principles that I hold very dearly. The first is that in spite of the sensationalism and the sheer madness that sometimes unfortunately characterises much of the Australian media's coverage of all things China, we are not, as Richard said, dealing with the rise of China, but the resurrection of China to the position that it occupied for much of human history. Many of you would be familiar with the term 中华民族伟大的复兴, and that's exactly what it is. Or indeed, the revival of the term 中心 within the discourse of certain sections of the Chinese leadership. Let us not forget that in 1793, when Lord Macartney journeyed to the Qing court at the request of His Britannic Majesty George III to open trade with China, the Celestial Empire then accounted for an enormous share of global GDP and achieved an unprecedented development paradigm that allowed for a level of sustainable population growth that was more or less in line with food production. But the Southern Song dynasty's Green Revolution is testament to the notion that while China never succeeded in achieving distinctly European modes of production and independent market forces, the major forces of production were expanded and relations of production were transformed to achieve a level of unparalleled production that arguably sustained China's population growth until the turn of the 19th century. The period gave rise to the dissemination of agricultural techniques and new crop varieties among the peasantry on a massive scale that was driven uniquely by the state. Seemingly despite the odds, the strength of China's state meritocracy and indeed its status as a unified empire prevailed. The state embarked on one of the largest irrigation infrastructure development programs in human history, and in doing so, the Middle Kingdom successfully engineered almost universal tripling of rice crops, and by all accounts, by the time the Great Khan's forces had conquered the Song, China possessed the most advanced agricultural technology in the world. The sustainable subsistence of the Chinese people was effectively guaranteed for the next 600 years, and the empire was engaged in unprecedented levels of foreign trade. China had reached a level of stability and harmony in unity that Confucius, or indeed a European monarch, could only dream about. Yet ironically, this stability was arguably at the great cost of China's entry into the then modernizing and rapidly industrializing world. China became trapped to her own nutritional base. Her stability and her splendid isolation were products of her unique capacity to feed herself. China's confidence in the strength of its institutions was so pronounced that the Qianlong Emperor responded to King George III's request for greater trade with the remark, 天下无所不有. Or indeed, as your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things in prolific abundance. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and I have no use